The gospel in a nutshell. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life.
Morning. My name is Daniel Morgan. I'm the associate pastor here at Resurrection Church. And Pastor Russ was supposed to preach the 8 a.m. service, and so I was arguing with him this past week, said, I want to preach the 8 a.m. service. And he's like, well, I'm already scheduled. I'm on the calendar. And I said, listen, I'm older than you are by 6 years. Therefore, clearly I can relate better to the 8 a.m. service. So listen, young man, you stay downtown, and I'll handle this. I just want you to know that you're fought over, that we love you. You had young men fighting after you this week. That may not have happened in many years for some of you. But I want you to know we love you. We're on our final week of the Remedy. We've been looking at the gospel, and we've been going through 1 Corinthians 15, which is the most succinct version of the gospel in the New Testament. And we've been taking some time to look at different elements of the gospel, something that is so often overlooked. And so in the first week, we talked about our need to continually be re-gospeled, to re-gospel ourselves and to re-gospel one another, because we will continually lose sight of the gospel like they did in Corinth. And we looked at what it looks like to stand in the gospel by which we are being saved, and to walk out the line of the gospel and its implications in different areas of our life. In week 2, we looked at how the gospel changes our past. In fact, we went and looked at many Old Testament references that predicted and prophesied the gospel, the coming of Christ and his death and resurrection. And last week, we looked at how the gospel changes our future. That we look at death differently, that we look at the afterlife differently, and that we even look at this life differently, that we are not living our best life now. In fact, for the believer, this life is as close as we will ever get to hell. Amen? And that is good news. So we've been looking at the remedy to the human condition. And now, like in every great story or every great movie, it's time for a flashback. And so we're going to go all the way back to 2 Kings, and we're going to take a look at this story that occurred somewhere 600 to 800 years before the coming of Christ, and really is probably only in the Old Testament simply to illustrate the gospel. It is a great foreshadow to the gospel. We're going to look at the story of Naaman, and from it, we're going to see 3 things. And I want you to take this away. These will be our big takeaways today. That because of the simplicity of the gospel, because of how simple it is, that the gospel is simply not shared, not accepted, and often underestimated. The gospel is simply not shared, not accepted, and often underestimated. And so in 2 Kings chapter 5, we have a story of Naaman, and we're going to meet 4 characters. And each of these characters in this story is going to illustrate something about the gospel to us. We're going to meet Naaman the warrior, and we're going to meet a little slave girl whom we don't even get her name. We're going to meet the king of Israel, and we're going to meet Elisha the prophet. Naaman the warrior, the little slave girl, the king of Israel, and Elisha the prophet. Join with me. We're going to start in 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Just in verse 1, we're already going to learn some things about this character of Naaman the warrior, and then in the next couple verses, we're going to learn a few more things. We're going to learn that Naaman was considered to be a great man, not a good man, but a great man. He was highly regarded. In fact, not only was he highly regarded by others, but we're going to find that he had access to the king of Syria. He could actually walk into the throne room, that was a very rare thing for someone to have access to a king. We're going to hear that he was a valiant warrior. So he was a man of men. He was brave. He was the person that rushed toward the fire instead of ran from it. We're later going to learn that he was also very wealthy, and he had a great deal of money. And then we learn at the very end here of verse 1, but he was a leper. So until I hit the but he was a leper, I've probably described someone that most of you would hope would marry one of your daughters. He was a great man. He was a brave man. He was a valiant warrior. He was highly regarded. He was wealthy. That means he had a job. But he was a leper. If you don't know anything about leprosy, leprosy is uncurable. Leprosy is a disease that eats away at the flesh. In fact, leprosy was a death sentence. As we read about lepers in the New Testament, you'll find that they were considered unclean. They were outcasts. In fact, even in some of the stories in the Old Testament, like King Uzziah, the moment leprosy broke out, they would carry them outside the town and they'd have to live apart and away from everyone else. And yet, Naaman is such a great commander and he's such a great man that even with leprosy, he has access to the king. But regardless of his competency, regardless of his skill, regardless of his accomplishments, regardless of his wealth, regardless of his fame, he can't cure a death sentence. He can't defeat it in battle. He can't buy it. He can't influence it. He can't outwork it. It's just death. And this, as we learn about Naaman, is at the root of the gospel. That you and I and this whole world, regardless of race, capability, achievement, stature, wealth, strength, or anything else, have a death sentence. It's called sin. And we're in need of a remedy. We can't control it. We can't find it. We can't create it. We can't produce it. Naaman has done everything right, and he's a leper. He's going to die. Naaman illustrates that we can have everything right and still be dead inside. I was arguing with someone about this the other day, and we were talking about coming to Christ and how life had gone since coming to Christ, and it had been rough for them. And I said, listen, you keep thinking there's this next level that you're going to earn. And what you need to learn is there's no extra level. There's no, if I could just make a little bit more, if I could just get a better job, if I could just get a better relationship. There's no way that step by step you earn some sort of peace in your life. That's not how peace comes. In fact, let's look at the wealthiest and most famous people in our country. They have the highest suicide rate. Why? They got to what they thought was the final level. I finally have financial security. I've married the supermodel. I finally have made it to be as famous as I think you can make it. And what is at the end of every single one of these roads is a cul-de-sac called death. And Naaman's there. He's achieved all of these things, and yet he can't solve this problem, much like you and I can't solve the sin problem on our own. Let's keep going, verse 2. Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his Lord, "Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." I just want you to consider a couple things about this little girl. First of all, she was stolen in a raid. She was enslaved. She's a foreigner, and she's very young. She has nothing going for her. Just a couple things to consider. I think many of us in her situation are not particularly concerned with the well-being of the people that have enslaved us. I would just submit to you that there's a lot of us that would have more of a desire for justice than we would for our master being cured. In fact, the little slave girl really has nothing going for her if you think about it. She's foreign, she's young, she probably has no skills. She was a woman in that time, which was probably very disregarded. She was a slave. She has one thing going for her. She has a faith in God. She has a faith that God is who he says he is, and he'll do what he says he's going to do. And so with no skills, with no competency, with no achievement, with no money, with no status, she simply says, I know who can cure you. She could have very easily, and I think for us, very justifiably, been angry at Naaman. Couldn't she? He's enslaved her. She's not getting paid to work there. She hasn't volunteered. Well, this is not a minimum wage argument. Let me ask you this. Is your circumstance causing you to no longer be on mission? You see, this little slave girl could have said, listen, if things were better, then maybe I could talk about my faith in God. You know, if my situation were just a little bit better, you know, if my financial security were just, if I could pay some bills, then I could worry about telling other people about the Lord. But I don't think you know my situation. I got to focus on me right now. That sound familiar? I hear that a lot. You know, listen, I got a lot going on right now. I feel like this little girl had plenty of reason to give excuses, probably a lot more reasons than you and I particularly have. And yet, she just simply says, hey, I know where the solution is, Naaman. One of the things that this slave girl is illustrating to us is that we need to stop underestimating the power of God. If she looked at herself the way the world looks at her, she would have dismissed anything. She'd have never spoken up. She never said anything. Because this little girl, in everyone else's eyes, would have been dismissed. And yet, what she's looking at is not her own power, not her own competency, not her own ability to cure Naaman, but rather a faith in a God who can and will. And instead of looking at her own life and her own circumstances and her own struggles and becoming bitter about them, becoming consumed by them, she speaks life into Naaman by saying, hey, I know where the cure is. How desperate does Naaman have to be? I mean, how many midnight infomercials has this guy signed up for? That a little teenage slave girl says, you know, there's a prophet in this other land, and he's like, let's go. How many things has he tried? How many essential oils has he rubbed on his ear trying to sell this thing? That the message would get through. How many times have we believed that we should stay silent because no one's going to listen to us anyways? And yet, the commander of the armies of Syria is going to listen to a little slave girl foreigner? We're going to find that he changes everything that he does. He travels to another land because a little teenage girl who's enslaved just speaks up and says, hey, the solution's over there. And yet you and I, though we know because of the Great Commission that our sole purpose beyond loving and worshiping God is to spread the good news, we know that we are left on this earth to share this news, so often dismiss the message because of either what we're going through or because we doubt the power of the message. The slave girl illustrates to us that our job is simply to point people to the gospel. It's the only skill we need to have. You don't need to be a pastor. You don't need to be trained. You simply need to know that's where you get saved. That's where you get saved. And be bold enough to say something about it. As you keep reading the second part of verse 5, so he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, when this letter reaches you, you know that I have sent to you Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read this letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy. Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me. So first things first, Naaman loads up on wealth. Why? Because in human terms, a great cure must have a great cost. And so in his mind, that's going to take money. He gets it. He knows there's a great cost involved. Now, he doesn't know what that cost is. In him, it's earthly terms. And what does the king say? I love the king. The king tears his clothes. You would tear your clothes when you were grieving. You would tear your clothes when there was great grief. The king hears the message. Wait, you expect me to heal you? And he tears his clothes. He's going into mourning. And then he says, this is a setup. I can't cure you. You're trying to come up with false pretenses. You want to go to war. I know what this is. It's a setup. Think about this. This is the king of God's chosen people. Consider this for just a minute. This is the king of God's chosen people. And so the slave girl believes that God can cure Naaman. The king of God's chosen people does what? He doesn't just doubt. He completely dismisses the idea that God has the power to save this man. He rips his clothes. He goes into mourning. He begins to scream, well, this is a setup. You see, the slave girl is enslaved in a foreign country. She has no choice over her life. She has no competency. She's dismissed, but she understands and believes in the power of God. The king of Israel lives comfortably behind his walls, in his palace. He's not dependent on God. Therefore, he doesn't experience the power of God. And because he doesn't experience the power of God, even though he's the king of God's people, he's not expectant on God to do anything at all. While the slave girl illustrates to us that we simply need to have a faith in God and point people to the cure, the king of Israel does the opposite. The king of Israel reminds us that we can be God's people, and yet we can become so comfortable living behind our walls that we lose all expectancy of what God's going to do. That we get so comfortable, even as God's people, that our circumstances get too good that we have lost sight of the power of God. And when you begin to lose sight of the power of God, you lose all expectancy that he's going to do the things that he says he's going to do. The king of God's people has no expectancy that God's going to move. And as a result, he doesn't believe that God is the solution for his or anyone else's needs. This is actually the definition of functional atheism. In title, this is the people of God. In fact, this is the ruler of the people of God in title, but in practice, he is just like the world. He might as well be one of these foreign tribes. He might as well be a Gentile. In title, called by God to rule the people, but in practice, off mission. Because of our American culture, because many of us were raised in church, because religious holidays around Judeo-Christian ethics and Judeo-Christian tradition have caused us to go to church for lots of different reasons, whether those were because our family did, because there are holidays for those things, because we're just used to it. Many of us in title and in calling as the people of the Lord, we continue to do the things that the people would do, but in actuality, we are functional atheists. We don't experience the power of God. We don't see the power of God. We don't expect the power of God. And when other people have issues and problems and death and bitterness and unforgiveness, we're not pointing them to God anymore because we don't expect him to move. We haven't just lost our passion for God. We don't expect him to do anything about it. And when the king is faced with an incurable disease, he doesn't for 1 second think about the power of God. He doesn't for 1 second think, how much glory will God get if he cures this Syrian general? He rips his clothes. He says it's a setup. And he starts to think about the political impact of the letter. And how often have we, as the people of God, done that? Overlooked the power of God, lost our expectancy for God's power, and instead just considered the implications of what speaking up would do, of what is functional atheism. It's calling ourselves Christian and living a life like God doesn't exist. The king illustrates what happens when we, the people of God, get off mission, when we become more about our comfort than worshiping God. Verse 8, but Elisha hears. But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? You don't believe in God? You don't believe that God's real? You don't believe that God moves? Why in the world would you do this, king? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. I can imagine the pomp and circumstance of the general of Syria with all of the wealth and all of the chariots and all of the men and all of the servants and all of the horses riding up to Elisha's house. You see the procession of people. The president just came into town. I think he flew in on Air Force One, but and they always show the procession, and there's like all of those black SUVs. There's this big line. It's like a parade, and there's limos, and there's all of these different things. I could see Naaman driving up in his big black SUV. I'm Naaman, coming into the neighborhood. And Elisha comes out to greet. Oh no, Elisha doesn't come to see him. Elisha sent a messenger to him. He's outside Elisha's house. He's like 50 feet away. Elisha doesn't go see him. Elisha sends a messenger. That's like my wife sending me a text from the living room. Just get up and walk over here. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. But Naaman was angry. And he went away saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar and the rivers of Damascus better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. This is the offense of the gospel. And let me just take a minute to explain the offense to Naaman, and then I want to talk about how offensive the gospel is for you and I and our country today. First off, Naaman is offended by the delivery. How dare you not even come out to meet me? How dare you send a servant with a message when I'm here at your home and I've traveled all the way from Syria with all of these chariots to come and see you? And yet it's another servant. It was a slave girl that got me here, and now it's a servant that's walking out here to deliver the message. He's offended by the delivery. And he's offended by the solution. See, he had an expectation of what the solution would look like. You can see it in the text. He thought the prophet was going to come do some sort of magical thing. He wanted to see the hands wave. He wanted some pomp and some circumstance. He wanted to get he wanted all of the stuff. He wanted the magic wand. Instead, he gets a messenger with a very simple thing. Go wash in this river. Now, here's what you don't know about the Jordan. The Jordan River was really pretty muddy most of the time. There was a lot of clay around it, so it looked pretty ugly. And oftentimes, it was sluggish. It didn't even run like a river. It just kind of moped its way downhill. And the rivers that he's talking about, they were cool and gushing. They were the ones you put on the brochure when you want someone to visit. In fact, the Barada is known to the Greeks and the Romans as the river of gold. And so it would be like comparing Lake Tahoe to Buena Vista. We call that Duck Crap Pond. No one's putting Buena Vista on the brochure. No one's putting the Jordan River on the brochure. Naaman's offended by the delivery, and he's offended by the solution. He had this expectation of what the solution needed to look like. Now, he couldn't solve the problem. He didn't have the cure. He was in need of the help, but he had an idea of what it would look like. And when it didn't look like that, he got angry. See, we often do the same thing. We have an expectation of how God's going to show up. He needs to show up in a certain way. In fact, for those of us that don't have a relationship with God, one of the most offensive things is this idea that the solution is free, and it's so simple. And his offense blocks him from the remedy. We have that same choice. We can be offended or we can be healed. Some of us would rather be offended than to be healed. Let me just say this about the offense of the gospel. As a believer, it's my job that the most offensive thing about me is the gospel. It's my job as a believer. Let me tell you why this is so important. In 2020, we're in an election cycle, if you hadn't heard. And I don't really care what you watch, whether you watch the Democratic National Convention and some of these debates that have been going on, if you're on social media, if you just listen to people. But politics have always been divisive, but I guess we get to see it more. It's more in our face now. And it's interesting that while we watch this political mess roll itself out in our country, what might be the most divisive of things in our culture, we get to counter with what should be the most unifying thing in our culture, which is the gospel. I have lots of political views, but let me be very clear, the most offensive thing about me is supposed to be the gospel. You may have many political views, but if you follow Jesus Christ, let me be clear, the most offensive thing about you should be the gospel. That may mean some things need to die in your life. If there are things in your life that are more offensive than the gospel, I would submit to you, you have some reprioritization to do. Amen? He's offended by the delivery. He's offended by the solution. And his offense blocks him from the cure. Elisha illustrates for us that the Jesus that saves us is someone that we'll never see till death. And you find it interesting that the cure is given to Naaman. He never sees Elisha. We read in 1 Peter 1:8, and Peter's writing to the church, he says, "Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that he is inexpressible and filled with glory." For the believer, we will fall in love with Jesus Christ, though we will never see him until after death. And in this story that is illustrating the gospel, the prophet Elisha never sees Naaman, Naaman never sees Elisha, and yet the cure is just as real. The solution is just as potent. Naaman never needs to set eyes on Elisha. He almost misses it. Here's verse 13. But his servants came near and said to him, "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you." Do you see how the servants notice it's a great word? Like Naaman misses it and he's angry, and the servants are like, "Did you not just hear the message? You can be cured. You got to go down to this river. You got to wash 7 times, and that's it?" And Naaman's walking away. He's ready to go back to Syria with leprosy. And the servant recognizes it. "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. This is the 3rd servant in this story. You had a slave girl, you had a servant that was a messenger, and now you have servants that are begging with Naaman, "Don't miss the message. Don't miss the cure. where are you going? Why would you go back to Syria? Did you not hear the message? 3 different servants, a slave and 2 servants in this story. I don't want you to miss the parallels of the gospel, because this entire story is about the gospel. And the foreshadowing of the gospel just woven through this story. This is more than half a millennia before Christ, and yet this man has an incurable disease, sin. He can't fix the problem himself. He's incapable. Someone else must fix it. He can't pay for it. He can't earn it. He's merely told the solution by others. Everyone that communicates the solution to him are people of low esteem, people he would overlook, people that probably had no skills or competency other than just pointing him toward the message. The solution seems too simple and too underwhelming, and it's simple belief and obedience in the power of God, and it's so simple that he would walk away from it in pride. And the solution is a baptism. It's going to require some faith, because they think about this from Naaman's perspective. Not only is he going to go down to the river and he's going to have to dip himself in the river 7 times, but to do that he's going to have to disrobe. And when he disrobes, what he's going to be showing to that whole retinue that he brought with him, that big old procession of chariots and people and servants and probably guards and soldiers and everyone else, when he disrobes, what he's going to have to show to everyone is, my flesh is being eaten away. The thing that I could hide under the armor and the robes and everything else, I'm going to have to show to everybody. And now we're going to get to the real point, that even though I knew I couldn't cure this, now I'm going to have to admit to every single one of you that I'm actually dying, and I'm closer than you thought I was, and I have no control over this, and you're going to get to stare at it as I walk in and out of that river. And there's 6 times I'm going to walk in, and I'm going to come out of that muddy river, and I have the leprosy, and I'm just wet. And that's the pride problem. Is I finally got to let out that it's worse than I wanted to let on. And I can't do anything about it. And it's that 7th time when he comes up out of the water and his skin looks like a little baby, that he has finally a realization that it took an admittance that was worse than he thought it was, and that he didn't have control over it, and then he needed to be at a point where he could admit not only did he need the power of the solution, but he had to be able to admit it in front of everyone else too. There's great parallels here to the gospel. And this is the remedy. I sinned. Jesus died for that sin. He was resurrected, and because of that, he gives me a new purpose. You see, for the gospel to really penetrate our lives, for it to take root, for the belief in its power to be real, for salvation to take hold, we have to reach a point in our lives where we know we need God. The gospel can never be plan B, the fallback plan. You don't get to test try the gospel. And until each of us recognizes it, there can't be real belief in the gospel. What is the application for you and I as the believer? Well, there's many. If you already know Christ, our lives so often do not proclaim the power of the gospel. They proclaim the power of things that we think we've gotten good at. They proclaim the power of our self-discipline. They proclaim the power of our religiousness. They proclaim the power of our politics or our morality or our hard work. But those things aren't the gospel. And none of those things saved us, nor will they save anyone else. Listen to me, believer. The world doesn't need our advice. They don't need our political views. They don't need our morality. They don't need our style or our method or our capability. The world needs more little slave girls who believe in the power of God, who stopped trying to fix people and culture, who stopped relying on our own ability or capability or achievement or skill. But when the church begins to live a life that fundamentally is dependent on God, begins to experience the power of God in our individual lives, begins to see the power of God working in our corporate life, then we begin to be expectant that God is who he says he is, and therefore he will do the things that he said he'll do. And when a church gets expectant and begins to desire and want after that move of God, everything begins to change in the tone and the heart of a church. No longer is the church about how things get done. Rather, we're excited to wonder how God's going to move. That is a church that begins to experience revival when we have an expectation that God's going to move in the most hopeless of circumstances. When we're faced with people with leprosy and all we can think about is how much glory God will get when he cures it, instead of wondering what we should do about it. Too many of us live our lives as if we've never had leprosy and we went swimming in the Jordan for fun. Lost sight of the fact that we didn't just desperately need God when we didn't know him, but we desperately need God now, and I'm going to desperately need him tomorrow, and I'm going to desperately need him until the day he calls me home. Too many of us lose sight of the saving power of the gospel every day. It's why we keep coming back in here and needing to be re-gospeled. The gospel is so simple, and because it's so simple, it's often not shared. When we lose sight of the gospel, church, we begin to think that we need to cure leprosy with these other solutions. We begin to lose sight of the fact that it is only through the gospel that anyone experiences any real change in their life. And sometimes the very simplicity of the gospel works against us, and we begin to think we need to add on to it these other things for it to be really potent and effective. That is a lie. The gospel is simple, and because it's simple, it's often not accepted. It requires humility to experience the gospel. It requires humility to accept the gospel. The moment you think you've earned something, you're no longer standing in the gospel. The gospel is often underestimated. It's not only underestimated by those who don't yet know the Lord, it is often underestimated by you and I who have a relationship with God, and yet we continue to underestimate its saving power. I want to offer you two different things today. If you're here today and you don't know if you have a relationship with Jesus, I just want to ask you this question. Have you made a declaration of faith to Jesus? Have you come to a point in your life where you said, I can freely and openly admit that I can't cure me, and I'm willing to put my belief and faith in what Jesus did and let him take over? Naaman, for all of his merit and his ability, could have stood on the bank of the river all day long and never been saved. It took steps of faith. It took admitting he couldn't fix the problem. It took undressing in front of everyone for them to see that disease, for him to walk into those muddy waters with leprosy on full display. The very thing he tried so hard to cover up had to become public for everyone to see. If what is stopping you from putting your faith in Jesus Christ is that you're not exactly sure how other people are going to handle the fact that you really need Jesus, let me just let you in on this secret. We all need Jesus. Will you respond to God's call on your life? You may be here today wondering why you keep showing up. You get up here and some preacher tells you you're doing everything wrong. You're not even sure if you really believe in this in the first place, but you keep coming back. I just want you to tell you that you're not coming back because we speak well. You're coming back because God is drawing you to him. He loves you and he is wooing you. He is pulling you in. He is chasing you. And you wonder why you keep showing up. It's because he is after you. He says, I'll leave the 99 and I'll come find you. But you have to reach the point where you'll accept that invitation. The conviction that you feel pulling yourself toward Jesus is him calling you to life with him. Our elders are going to come up right now, and I want to offer you the opportunity to come up and pray with one of our elders, and we will walk you through what it looks like to declare a dependency on Jesus Christ, to declare with your mouth that he is God, that he died for your sins, and that you're putting your faith in him. And to follow up with you what it looks like to demonstrate that in your life as you begin to pursue relationship with Jesus. In fact, we're going to do baptisms in just a minute. You have an opportunity to not only put your faith in Jesus Christ, but to be baptized. This is the next step for a believer. Now, that may seem like a scary thing, but let me assure you that when Naaman came up out of those muddy waters the 7th time, he probably thought that Jordan was the most beautiful river that he'd ever seen. Secondly, I want to offer you, believer, this opportunity. If you know Jesus Christ and you've been here during this series, you got one of these cards, I hope, in your bulletin about 4 weeks ago. And what we asked you to do is to write down the names of people that God's put in your path that are far from God, to begin praying for those people that he would draw them to him, that he would begin to tenderize their hearts, that he would begin to open their eyes to spiritual things, that would give you an opportunity as someone who knows the good news to invest in their life, to serve them in some way, to show them the humility that is often required to draw them to Christ, to invest in them. And then at some point to invite them. Now, maybe in these 4 weeks you've had opportunities to do that. Maybe you've seen them respond to God in some way, but maybe there are people on your list that you're still praying for. I got 5 people here. I'm still praying for them. Some of these I've been praying for 3 years. They're not here yet. And I want to offer you an opportunity in just a moment as we play this invitation song to come up to the altar and to continue to pray for the people that God's put on your heart. You're in their life for a reason. And if you've been given an opportunity to speak to them, to invest in them, to sacrifice for them, to serve them, to give to them, the reason that you were put in their life is to have an opportunity at some point to share the gospel with them. And I'm going to give you an opportunity in just a moment to bring that card or bring those people up to the altar and just pray over them. And just ask God not only to draw them, but to continue to change and tenderize your heart to bleed for those people. When you meet people and they begin to ask you any sort of spiritual question, that is your sign that God is at work in their heart. People do not come to spiritual questions on their own. They come as Jesus is doing work in their life and is awakening their spirit to spiritual things, and then puts you in their path at opportune times to share the good news, to be the little slave girl who says, I don't know what I don't know, but I know where Jesus is at. So just a moment. I'm going to close this in prayer. You're going to move as the Lord leads. You can come up and pray for these people, and if you don't know Christ, you have an opportunity to come up and talk to one of our elders or our pastors. Let me pray for us. Father God, thank you for the gospel. Thank you for your Son. Thank you for sending him to make a way where there was no way, God. Thank you for awakening us and wooing us and pulling us and attracting us to you, God. Thank you that you loved us when we didn't love you. God, thank you for the gospel. God, for the people that are sitting here being re-gospeled, the people, God, that you're wooing and attracting to you, God, that you would just continue to compel them and pull them to you and let them see the beauty that is in your Son. We thank you for what you're doing here today and what you'll do this week, God, as we walk out onto a mission field in this place called Bakersfield and share the good news. In Jesus' name, amen. You move as the Lord leads.